Zoom So hi, everybody. I am Erin Robinson. I'm the community coordinator for the Sampling Nature Research Coordination Network. And I'm just admitting a few more folks from the waiting room. But I'm going to share my screen and give a brief introduction of the Sampling Nature project. And then we will dive right into Sarah's talk. So I think that you see my screen. So if you are joining us for the first time or returning to this webinar series, we'd love to have just a little bit about you in the chat. So if you want to add your name, organization, and your interest in samples, this whole project is about understanding the community and the community's interest in physical specimens. So first of all, I wanted to acknowledge the leadership team of this project. Some of them are on the call today. Actually, I think several of them are on the call. Kirsten, Jane, Neil, and Sarah are all here. I haven't seen Ramona join, but this group comes together across domain. And really the motivation for the Research Coordination Network is that there are a plethora of samples. There are millions of samples out in the world today, and science today demands that we have fair or findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable samples to ensure the transparency and reproducibility of research. When we can bring samples together, we can do more interesting research, and we can enable previously impossible connections between diverse and disparate samples. But this is a multidisciplinary problem. And so what's really interesting about our team and about this project is that it crosses disciplines. So Sarah today is going to talk about some of the research happening in the archaeology community, but our team crosses domains with including geo, bio, as well as indigenous and traditional knowledge. And so what that looks like is when these different specific communities come together, they have custom metadata fields. And so what we're really trying to understand, both with Sampling Nature and with our partner project iSamples, is how to harmonize these community-specific metadata models. And so I would encourage you, as you listen to the talk today, to think about what is common from what Sarah's describing that could be reapplied in your discipline. And I think that'll provide some fodder for us to talk about in the discussion section of this call too. So welcome. We've had a couple of people join since I have been giving this intro, and if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat, that would be super. So I want to read a little bit of Sarah's bio because I think that there are some interesting points there. And of course, so Sarah is, and maybe I'll stop sharing here, and Sarah, you can start sharing, and that'll help us switch between these two things. So Sarah is the executive director of the Alexandria Archive Institute, which is a California nonprofit organization that develops Open Context, a data publishing service for archaeology and cultural heritage. She has a PhD in archaeology and has spent more than 25 years conducting zooarchaeology research in sites in the Middle East and Europe. And she collaborates on projects that advance data publishing and data literacy in various archaeological and cultural heritage communities. Of note here, I mentioned she's the co-I on the Sampling Nature project, and most recently, she's the co-director on Advancing Fair and Care Practices in Cultural Heritage, which was a new project funded by IMLS. So today she's going to talk about sampling identifiers with big impacts, examples from archaeological fieldwork. So Sarah, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. Erin, that was a great introduction, and I appreciate everyone for attending today. Yeah, so I am as Erin mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Alexandria Archive Institute, and we work on developing and supporting Open Context, which is an open access data publisher for archaeological content. And so a lot of what I do is working with individuals on getting the data that they collect during their fieldwork out there onto the web via Open Context. But I'm first an archaeologist, and specifically a zooarchaeologist. So I've spent about a few decades working in different sites in the Near East and in Europe on analyzing animal bones. And so a lot of what I'm sharing today comes from my own experiences in the field as a specialist, working with collecting data and documenting data and trying to fit it into the project data that these large excavation projects produce, and struggling with the challenges around people working in different timelines and different locations and trying to integrate their data both within projects and then across projects, and then also with the wider world in an interdisciplinary setting. So the importance of identifiers is difficult to convey to many researchers that lack formal training in databases or data management, which is in archaeology is most researchers. And while we all use identifiers in our work, we rarely think about how they might be interpreted differently by different people, or how they might clash with other identifiers or cause confusion to future researchers. So as an example, two researchers on the same project working on different classes of materials usually have so little communication with each other about the details of their data documentation that they wouldn't know that they were accidentally using the same prefix and numbering system. And this is an exaggeration to make a point, but it's a very real thing that happens with a prefix for the name of the site, like DT, and a numbering system starting with 1. If these two researchers only worked within their own data sets and never connected out to other data, this numbering system would work. But as soon as you try to put these two data sets together, you have duplicate identifier names for different types of artifacts. So there's a fix for this, but updating thousands of identifiers in a spreadsheet is one thing that's pretty simple, but going back to change the number you wrote on thousands of artifacts is another thing. So better identifier practices from the outset of a project can save a lot of time, money, and frustration. So it tends to be underappreciated how small identifiers can have big downstream impacts on data reuse. And today I'm going to discuss some common identifier challenges that occur in the context of an archaeological field project, and small changes that can be made in documentation behaviors and workflows to help improve identifier creation and management to promote data reuse. So to provide some background to the archaeological setting of this discussion, different archaeological artifacts, ecofacts, such as animal or plant remains associated with past human behavior, architectural features, and stratigraphic deposits are all understood in relation to one another. Such relationships inform the understanding of context, which is a core interpretive concept in archaeology. Naming and identifying the locations, objects, and other things involved in these contextual relationships make identifier practices critically important to archaeology. To complicate matters, much archaeological analysis and interpretation takes place much later than the excavation, and in different places, and often by people totally unassociated with the original excavation. So over time, archaeological collections and samples can lose clear association with each other, with important data that provides context for them. And I'm just showing this image of a random excavation just to show the complexity of and how big excavations can be, with all the different people doing different things in different squares, way far apart from each other, documenting in all different ways on paper, through photographs, and possibly in tablets, and collecting a bunch of different data sets. So it's very, very complex, and it's hot, and it's windy, or it's dusty. And so there's all sorts of things going on that can complicate things in the field. So many of these downstream issues with information loss, though, start at the point of data creation. And today I'm drawing on a project that my organization and colleagues undertook starting in 2016 with NEH funding, called the Secret Life of Data Project, that looked at these issues with archaeological data. So the SLOW Data Project explored the data lifecycle across 4 field school projects, archaeological field schools, selected in order to explore transmission of data management practices to novices. It involved transdisciplinary researchers from the information sciences and archaeology interested in understanding archaeological data reuse. So while we were interested in the entire data lifecycle, we focused on reuse and creation. If problems are introduced during creation, data will not successfully be reused later on, even if processing, analysis, preservation, and sharing all occur. So we wanted to see if we could identify common practices that begin at the moment of creation that cause reuse challenges. Our data collection involved researcher interviews, structured and semi-structured interviews before and during field work with key project personnel. Field observations, we went 2 weeks to each project with 2 or more seasons of observation. Database analysis, sorry, the usual spam caller of the day. Database analysis, assessment of consistencies in the kinds of data recorded and database structures at each site. And then we also did reuser interviews. We did 25 interviews with existing or potential reusers of the kinds of archaeological data produced by these projects in order to understand how archaeological data are reused and the pushes and pulls that allow for data to be reused in the future. Let me just close the door here. So today I'm going to share results from field observations and interviews at one site in our study. I'll discuss the problems that we found that were specifically related to identifiers. And I'll share some of our attempts to find pragmatic improvements to streamline identifier practices during archaeological fieldwork, as well as the impacts these recommended solutions had on individuals, teams, and future data use. We attempted to find solutions that could be feasible to implement in challenging field conditions. And because internet connectivity is hard, our approaches also had to be appropriate for physical media. Identifiers get handwritten on tags, bags, boxes, and often on the artifacts themselves. This creates some important constraints. We hoped to keep within the limits of physical media and limit disruptions to existing practices at the sites, all while promoting greater long-term persistence and more global findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability of archaeological samples. Because identifiers are key to linking and cross-referencing related data, they play a central role in expressing and communicating many aspects of context. Breakdowns in the management and use of identifiers undermine the contextual integrity of data. In this example, misalignment of context identifiers in the animal bone data set at the top and the context data set in the middle break contextual associations of the zooarchaeological observations. Unrecognized errors in contextual associations may lead to mistaken inferences, as records from different data sets, for instance, a zooarchaeological data set and a numismatic data set, may get associated in error. Similarly, unnoticed, repeated use of the same identifiers may lead to miscounting of individual specimens. As I noted, context plays a core role in archaeological interpretation and knowledge creation. It involves understanding relationships between things. And important to archaeology are things like stratigraphy, such as this deposit of dirt comes after this other deposit of dirt. Associations, such as this pot was found next to the same hearth feature as this grinding stone, and increasingly many more. Archaeological method and theory continues to expand the kinds of contexts regarded as important. So excavation methodology, excavator training, positionality, funding sources, and etc. are all seen as important to inform context. Expressing and understanding context fundamentally requires identifier management. One needs to name specific things to describe how they relate. So this is a core aspect of documenting context, but it's something that is rarely discussed by archaeologists, and it's really largely taken for granted. So our case study excavation was a long-standing excavation with more than 50 years of ongoing fieldwork. The project team consisted of 60 team members, including 40 students. Graduate students and experienced returning undergrads were assigned to be the trench supervisors and reported to a field director. Trench supervisors used an apprenticeship model to teach first and second year students assigned to their teams. The project director didn't provide any formal sort of written guidelines or training. Instead, trench supervisors relied on notebooks and site reports from previous years as a model. Additionally, one trench supervisor developed and shared an informal one-page reference sheet with other team members that detailed important information to include in notebooks, but this was just an informal reference sheet. There were also various specialists who were working on different material types. mainly during the excavation season, but not necessarily on the currently excavated material. Often analysts were working on material that was excavated several decades ago. And I mention all of this because this context of data production with a large team with many new participants, changing team members year to year, and visiting specialists popping in here and there for short periods is all very typical of archaeological excavations and is really a setup for all sorts of confusion. So our examples here are going to highlight some of that. So the first challenge I wanted to discuss is inconsistent field documentation. At our case study excavations, team members in training learn how to label finds by modeling theirs on the find tags and the notebooks written by trench supervisors or other team members from previous years, as I mentioned. So this already created differences in how tags were written across different excavation areas, how dates were written, and how things were abbreviated. Furthermore, the numbering system for the small finds, and small finds are individual finds that are recorded in situ and sent for specialist analysis because there's something special about them. This numbering system was overly complex and created confusion. The project followed a long-standing practice of numbering small finds each day starting at number 1 in every single trench. And this meant that every trench had a number 1 find every single day, resulting in hundreds of number 1 finds and number 2 finds, number 3 finds, etc. So users needed to know, both like users of the later data needed to know both the trench number and the recording date to distinguish among several dozens, hundreds of objects labeled small find 1. Lastly, the process of labeling photos and associating them with trenches and objects occurred independently of the project database and could only be validated at the end of the season. So this was risking labeling errors that could go unchecked until the end of the season. Another challenge that we observed was siloed identifier creation in the field and among specialists. So as I mentioned before, archaeological data needs to be linked and interconnected within a project. The identifiers that excavation teams use to label their trenches, their units, and their finds are key to this interconnectedness to give objects context. The specialists coming in to study old material on a site have a special understanding of the importance of identifiers because they know how frustrating it is to not be able to find a database record for an object that isn't clearly labeled. However, other team members who don't work with artifacts downstream don't have this experience and so they don't really immediately see the importance of clear identifier practices. But they're the ones that are digging up the artifacts and doing the contextual documentation, so they play a really important role. At an excavation, responsibility for data creation is delegated to different people. So trench supervisors in the field and also specialists in the lab. But these different people don't necessarily have a consistent or reliable way to connect the data they document to a larger whole. So as an example of this, I just wanted to show notations on tags from our field, or the case study, to show a few of the different identifiers used in a project. So you can see there's different handwriting on these tags. And that is because the one circled A is the special find noted in the field by the excavator, so special find number 37. And number B, the B identifier circled is actually the identifier that was given to this object when it was cleaned by the conservator in the lab during conservation right after excavation. And they just jotted that down on the tag and put it into their own spreadsheet. And then this thing was a bone, it's a tooth, and it went to the zooarchaeologist and they worked on it and identified it in their own spreadsheet with this phone number, 12,003. And so basically all of these different identifiers are unique to each of the different specialists. But the identifiers B and C never made it back to the notebook where the special find number 37 was written. So that notebook will never contain the downstream identifiers that contain further analysis and further observations on this object. This is just another sort of description of what the confusion that goes on in the field, and showing a quote from a reuser that had frustrations about what happens to their data and how it gets siloed. So this is basically like the journey of a special find in the field, a small find. It's, those are used interchangeably in this site. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure what happens next. So basically something is found in the field. It gets put in the trench notebook and is given an ID in the field, and then it goes over to conservation. And the conservator, like I showed in the previous slide, cleans it and makes some notations, gives it another number for conservation notes. But that number never gets really sent back to the field notebook. At some point, the director or somebody looks at this find and decides if it actually is something special, if it needs an additional number, in which case it goes to the catalog and it gets a catalog number and it gets put in the project database. However, it also needs to be further identified by a specialist if it's a bone or a coin or a piece of pottery. Whoever has that specialization needs to look at it, and that person might give it another number, which may or may not make it back to the catalog, which may or may not make it back to the database, and almost never makes it back to the trench notebook because that thing is long gone and put into storage after the field season. So there's lots and lots and lots of places where there can be loss of information and identifier problems along the way. So getting to our third challenge then, which is connecting physical media with digital media. Most researchers don't really think about good identifier practices, as I've said. This is largely because humans can make sense of things that are written down and possibly inconsistent, whereas computers need things to be exactingly precise and consistent for them to make sense. Furthermore, people have workflows and practices that they're used to and that they find efficient, even though if they may not be that efficient, and they're not super eager to change. So we saw this on our case study excavation when people went to search for things in the database. Someone trying to look up an artifact in the database would enter the catalog number they found written on an artifact or in a notebook entry, and sometimes it had a hyphen, sometimes it was abbreviated, sometimes it had a prefix. And all of these variations made it really difficult to know what to type into the database to search for that particular record. So this inconsistent use of identifiers in different information systems led to a lot of frustration and wasted time trying to track down database records and match them to objects. So sorry for the numbering there. I don't know why that happened, but these are the three all number one important issues, the main challenges that we saw in the field related to identifiers that I'm focusing on today. So now I'm going to discuss our recommendations for addressing them and the impacts that they had on project data and project people. So our slow data team made multiple recommendations to improve naming practices in the field. So first, we recommended that the project include naming practices in their written instructions for students with examples of their use throughout the data lifecycle. So to highlight problems that occur downstream if recording on tags, for example, is inconsistent. And we also recommended that rather than starting with one every day, each trench should record small finds using a continuous sequence of numbers over the course of the field season from 1 to whatever in each trench. And this dramatically reduced the potential for identifier confusion by having only a handful of small find ones each season rather than dozens or hundreds. It also removed the need to include a date with the identifier. We also recommended designing a new data entry system using Kogel Toolbox, a suite of open source tools designed to support field data collection. And these could be used offline and included things like required fields with limited choices for data entry, including drop-down menus for trench numbers to minimize confusion, which streamlined and structured data entry. Importantly, this new data entry system used templates to automatically provide data creators with unique identifiers to write onto tags and other physical media. This made identifier expression more consistent, less ambiguous, and less error-prone. And in addition, Kobo Toolbox helped to automatically associate photos and the archaeological finds and the context being recorded. In the 2 field seasons since we made these suggestions, we've seen that these updates to recording practices have resulted in more consistently linked and integrated data and documentation within this project. The data coming out of the field season is more streamlined and has fewer inconsistencies when going through the data cleaning and publishing process in open context. So this is good news for reusers because it means that they're getting data that's better described and linked to other related content. And from a pedagogical perspective, these changes have also provided consistent content to use as examples of good recording practices for next year's batch of field school students. So this sets a baseline for good recording moving forward. For silo practices, as I described earlier, they led to data that can't be interpreted holistically. One reuser we interviewed described their need for contextual data, noting that I feel there is too much compartmentalization of our archaeological research in the sense that most sites divide still by material type, but none of us know how it all fits together. And that defies the purpose of what we're doing as archaeologists. So this lack of intellectual integration is reflected in the lack of data integration within a project data set and databases. One approach that our Slow Data project has advanced is having a specialist agreement written up jointly between the project director and every specialist working on a project. So this is a co-produced two-way agreement that sets out expectations from both parties and includes a face-to-face and ongoing discussions where you talk about plans for data integration within the project and for future use by others. It helps guide a conversation about data created by the specialist and the project, and helps establish data collection practices, especially around identifiers, to avoid loss of information or identifier collisions. And then importantly, this makes data management more than a checkbox, but something that is dynamic, open to change, based on participation by many people on the project. And we've published in Zenodo, a template of such an agreement that projects and individuals may use as a starting point. And if you do use this, we'd be curious to hear your feedback on how it worked. Okay, so recommendations for how to deal with physical and digital differences. In archaeology, research necessarily draws on data sets created by many people, from context information documented during excavations to the specialist analyses on macroscopic remains to chemical analyses conducted in laboratories, often years after the excavation concluded. It's critical that these various data types are linked and intelligible to others. Identifiers enable this linking and promote data quality that supports more open-ended reuse of data beyond the immediate needs of the creators. Identifiers that are global and persistent are ideal. However, as I mentioned, most individual researchers aren't prioritizing or even thinking about that. So like most projects, our case study used local entrenched conventions for identifier creation. And for good reasons, such as wanting identifiers to be short and be consistent with past identifiers and include clues to the context, such as the site name. So our challenge was to come up with a way of making those short IDs globally unique and persistent, but without major disruptions to the project's workflow. So here we have to thank the invaluable guidance of identifier experts in the iSamples project, some of whom or many of whom were on this call. They helped inform our current experiments that attempt to reconcile the local ID practices of the project, which are optimized for physical media, with the needs of the digital realm, especially with respect to global uniqueness and persistence. And then also I would like to thank Eric Kansa for his contributions to this section of the talk. To get down to it, essentially we're experimenting with a persistent URL scheme where the base of the URL is registered with easy ID and the ending suffix part of the URL is a local ID created by the project, excavators, and specialists. So when someone uses the field project's naming convention and writes PC 2003-006, for example, on an artifact or tag, you can take that and stick it into the URL and find that object in the database. This provides a clear map between physical objects and digital objects. It also encourages the practice of being able to directly look up a digital record of something written on a physical object by using the information you have at hand. So it's not exactly what's written on a tag, but it's close enough that you could figure it out, especially if we provide explicit directions in the facility in the lab where all the objects are being stored. But the great outcome is that you have an object that is linked to a digital record, which is linked to context information and all the other related content. And if you mess up, it gets a 404 error, but it goes to a landing page that explains the error and what the expected link should look like. So users get trained in what the identifier scheme is and how it works. This helps them learn why identifiers are important, so they will record their identifiers more clearly in the field at the time of data creation, hopefully. So we just started implementing this approach last summer, so we don't have impacts to report yet. But the aspiration is that there's a globally unique prefix that's important for archiving and citation, which is working in conjunction with a local system of identifiers that are easy to use, easy to write on objects, and don't disrupt the existing workflow too much. So if someone comes into the field lab when someone's not there to help them study objects in the trays there, then if there are clear directions for how to find things in the database, and they can use that to understand their context, they can more easily cross-reference the info they create with the rest of the project. And by doing so, it lives on beyond the project and beyond open context someday, because presumably that'll all resolve where open context data is archived. This is also really important for citation and linking these objects to a scholarly context. So some caveats that are that this requires some changes to practice, such as open context is not a conventional repository. It is a large database managing specific and highly granular records of archaeological things. So open context can manage record by record resolution of IDs to specific artifacts, but repositories with less granularity would need other approaches. Also, ARC identifiers have some character restrictions, specifically the dash character that requires some adaptation, so we had to use underscore. And objects are stored in a location where internet connectivity is difficult to maintain, so identifier resolution may not be that convenient all the time. So we plan to make observations in the summer of 2024 to determine how this approach is working on the site, and so that, I guess, will be the topic for a future talk. So I hope to have highlighted some of the ways that small identifiers can have big impacts on data intelligibility, reuse, and interoperability in archaeology. These challenges also extend beyond archaeology to linkages across adjacent scientific disciplines. And I want to finish by pointing you to a paper that Eric Kansa and I recently published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences on the impacts of identifier practices on data quality in archaeological science. In that paper, we go into more detail about this topic. And we also talk about how this applies to the care principles, where identifiers can help recognize and maintain the social context of information. So if you want to read more about that, be sure to check that out. Also, the Slow Data team has a paper in Advances in Archaeological Practice. Sorry, this is in the International Journal of Digital Creation, sorry, about challenges with specialist data, where we talk more about the specialist agreement that I showed you earlier. So we hope to have shown how researchers do not need specialized infrastructure or software to do a good job managing identifiers within their own projects. Data creation workflows that include coordination, checks, and enforcement of locally defined conventions for project participants are the main requirements. However, in wider context, good identifier management needs the support of dedicated infrastructure. So making sure that local practices are more rigorously and consistently applied is a first step. And a second step is building on these local practices with global infrastructure, so the identifiers are globally unique and have greater persistence, so archaeological data can maintain its contextual integrity and be able to participate in wider research applications beyond the discipline. And I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for funding the Secret Life of Data project. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful. I love the name, the Secret Life of Data project. So we have a lot of time for questions. And so I wanted to first, got some clapping. First, put it to the audience. Does anybody have a question they want to pick us off with? Sarah, Natalie has been putting the links to
Thank you.
The specialist agreement and and the papers in the chat, which is really wonderful too. So if maybe I'll ask a question while people are gathering their thoughts, but I'm curious about the Kobo toolbox and if that, and you mentioned field notebooks and people, writing things on paper. How did you see that transition going? Or was there already a digital sort of interface in the mix that Kobo was just building on top of?
Yeah, so there was this project, as I said, is really it's a long-term project. They had a database in place that, as many databases on projects that are sort of bespoke created for a project was just like slowly breaking over time and not getting fixed. And so it was every season it was sort of worse and worse, and they were having to come in and try to fix it. And the database manager, and this is also typical, he moved away and wasn't accessible anymore. And so it would just, I don't know if other fields see this too, but in archaeology, this happens a lot, where you get a lot of enthusiasm around building something, it gets built and it gets used for a while, and then it starts to fall to pieces. So anyway, it was time for a change. And so I mean, this solution using Kobo is, I mean, Kobo is, open source, it's widely supported, but it does require some techie knowledge to be able to set up. And so
Mhm.
luckily this project had Eric there who could do that for them. And so this is not something that like you could just do yourself, I think, unless you did
Yeah.
have that know-how. But so yeah, he set up, it's just a series of forms, and he created, I think it's 4 or 5 different forms that are, one is for photography, one is for trench context, one is for small finds. So basically, and all the forms link to each other so that you're able to do this integration without having to have data entered into separate systems. And so
Mhm.
the forms are easy to use. And again, like I said, they have these drop down menus. So trench is written correctly, and the numbers, you're not making like human errors and you're typing in your numbers and that kind of thing. And people were using them. I think it actually was quite easy for them to start using them uh, in the field. But what they did was they did keep doing their hand notations in their notebooks, and then they'd come in the
Yeah.
afternoon and they would enter stuff into the Kobo forms. I
Huh.
don't think everyone was using the notepads. I mean the pads in the field to actually enter, because it's sunny and it's hot and
Hot.
there's just a lot of field conditions don't lend themselves necessarily to working easily on a computer.
Yeah. So I've been watching hands. So I think it's Neil, Rory, and then Kirsten. So Neil, take it away.
Yeah, hi, Sarah. I just have I was wondering about reporting and how this might help. I imagine there's lots of regulations associated
Yeah.
with archaeology. And so do you work with governments?
Yeah.
Something they've open to, or
Yeah. So this is actually, so every jurisdiction is different, right? And so unfortunately, I think in every case, you're going to have to do something that's kind of customized. In this case, yes, there's reporting that's required by the government, and it has to be in a very, very specific format on PDFs, that of a way that they specifically want it. And so, in fact, we had the Kobo setup didn't deal with that, but the streamlined data collection did work for, we had a team of computer science students who actually took this on as their project last summer, and they built a form that would feed into PDFs in the way that the government wanted it. And I think that the trench supervisors were like just so happy to finally have this, because they would spend days at the end of the season pulling information into the structure that the government required. So that was a nice fix. Again, the government will probably change their requirements and it'll have to be redone
right.
sometime soon. But yeah. But yeah, the cleaner data did streamline that process.
And does that
Thanks.
reporting, sorry, just carry on for years? I mean,
Yes.
Updates to what happened, the governments want to know about it 3 years
Yep.
after, 5 years after.
They want to know after every season, and honestly, I don't know what happens to that. Those like basically PDFs, and then you have to print them and send them in. I mean, it's just it's very laborious. So I'm not sure what happens beyond that, but it's the annual requirement to keep your permit.
Thanks.
Cool. That was a great question. Next up, we have Rory.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. So yes, my question, I have 2 questions. The first one is, are you, being an archaeologist, are you aware of Fieldmark? Or maybe you know it as FAMES 3. Are you aware of FAMES?
Oh, I thought you said field work, and I was like,
Fieldmark,
yeah.
FAMES.
Yes, I'm aware of FAMES.
Yes. And I won't say did you, so which has now been almost ready to be released as a much less clunkier version, which works on mobile phones. called FieldMark. So FieldMark is
Okay,
the new
okay.
version of
Great,
FAME.
great.
So I won't. So well, which is kind of, it's interesting because it was developed by archaeologists. It's a generic tool,
Yeah.
but it was developed by archaeologists. So it sounds like Kobo tool is a generic tool which is being used by archaeologists. But this is actually designed around archaeological workflows. It's an offline field data capture notebook in effect, which is used on delivered on mobile phone. So yeah, what do you think about FAMES, and did you consider using that, or was it yeah?
Yeah, so we have worked actually with the FAMES folks, and I think FAMES is doing awesome work. We have worked with them on looking at how to streamline data collected using FAMES, or I guess using FieldMark now, into the data publishing pipeline into open context. And so that's been the context in which we've worked with them more. But we haven't we haven't used it specifically for field data collection at a specific site.
It's not quite ready, but it will be ready soon. But yeah,
that is great to know, because we get a lot of people coming to us saying, please help, we need data collection tools for our site. And it's so site specific, but having a baseline to start with would be amazing.
okay, great, thank you. And my second question is also like an alternative. For your identifier, did you consider using IGSNs, and if not, why not?
So we this is more of an Eric question, I think, or maybe Raymond could get into details on this, but we have archaeological samples are all over the place. So it's we obviously it's not just geosamples. We have artifacts and we have ecofacts, and then we also have trenches that get identifiers. So basically ancient contexts that once existed but are now destroyed. And so it's a whole bunch of different diverse types of things that need identifiers. And so we are using arcs for that, partly because they support a hierarchy. So basically this identifier that, this convention that we've set up for the project, has the P24 is the part for the project, and then it's followed by another identifier for the sub area of the field project, like the trench or whatever. And then like another identifier that means it's faunal remains, or that it means it's plant remains, or that it means it's ceramics that are being analyzed. And then the ID that the specialist or whoever the cataloger gave it. So we found that the ARC setup was useful for that. And
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks.
Raymond, if you want to chime in anything, feel free. Okay. Kirsten?
Yeah, my question was actually nearly the same as Rory's, because I saw in your presentation about all the challenges in the field work, the duplication of, assigning. For us, it's, field season in Hawaii and HW1 and so on. It's basically exactly the same issues, and the need for short identifiers that that can be generated in the field and fit on a label. So all these requirements are sort of insights led to the development of the IGSN as it used to be, and yeah, I wanted to know the same way, why did you choose to go for ARC rather than the IGSN? I what you just said with respect to these different entities that you need to identify and so on, the IGSN deals with that. Because you have the relationships between different objects that are identified. Was any of that decision actually related to the fact that the IGSN now is a DOI and needs membership in DataCite and so on? Did that play a role?
I don't think so. This is, maybe we can ask Eric to respond to this later in more detail. It goes back, we've been using DOIs and ARCs minted by the EasyID system through the California Digital Library Merit System for, I mean, through their Easy ID minting service for years and years. So this is something that we
I
have
see.
committed to and been using for before there were, yeah, that was not something that we considered.
I mean, would the system actually accommodate either? That, you know, if one group decides they rather use ARCs and the other one decides
Yeah.
they rather use
Mhm.
IGSNs, both would be, you know, would be possible,
Mhm.
and both have sort of the same features and benefits. That's, you know, I would be interested in.
Yeah, and that I think would be a nice thing to maybe have a webinar about. You know, discussing how these
Maybe
things
interesting. I
interact.
mean,
Mhm.
you know, I know that Rory is involved with projects that implement the IGSN, and FAMES had, you know, used IGSN from the beginning. So I think that it would be interesting to actually get some insights from them where, you know, how it worked, and because there's I think a little longer history already of usage. So yeah, I think might be nice to have a webinar about that.
Mhm.
Totally. And it's that convenience, as you mentioned, you know, you have already used a certain supplier of
Yeah.
identifiers, and then you stick to that, you know, but
Mhm.
it's an interesting experience, you know, to say, okay, these are the criteria that influence why
Right.
you use one identifier over the other.
Mhm.
Great talk, by the way. I loved it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. Oops, Rory, you got a hand up.
So I don't want to dominate, but just quickly I think that to follow on Kristen's point, because we were both just in Salzburg last week at the RDA, and I was in like multiple sessions about PIDs, about identifiers, and I met a guy approached me from the Helmholtz Institute, who's actually one of his main tasks is to figure out how to recommend for the whole of all of Helmholtz what PIDs to use, what PIDs to adopt, and there's a whole series of technical issues, usability issues, political issues. So as you say, Kirsten, it's a rich field for discussion and lots of considerations, but and also fast developing. So I think that is actually a really interesting area for discussion. And it was interesting to see how you described your case, Sarah. It was more just, well, this is what we were doing, so we just kept doing it, as opposed to a conscious evaluation and decision about the various considerations. I suspect going forward, people will be making doing more in a more systematic way, because there's so much more available now. But yes, I think that would be a great topic for discussion.
Cool. Well, we are gearing up for thinking about our January webinar series, or the webinar series as it relaunches in January. So maybe this could be a topic. Any last burning questions? If not, we can thank Sarah again. Sarah, this was wonderful. I think it's such a rich talk and topic that you're exploring, and I really love the information science components of it too. So it's neat to see all of that come through. Sarah, do you want to put your email in the chat if you're comfortable? Is that the best way that if anybody wanted to follow up individually? And as we're wrapping it up, I'm going to just share my screen one more time for ways to stay involved. Sampling Nature is about building community. So we've been working on the website and we'll continue to evolve that and add more resources, but we're adding the recordings of the webinars, including this one will be there. I mentioned that the webinar series will return in January, and if you have topic ideas, I'm looking for those topics now. We have our third workshop that's coming up in December, and then we'll also be at AGU. There are 2 sessions that are, I think, pretty relevant to the samples community And it should be IN 33B. I'm sorry, it's IN 31A and IN 33B. And then we also have space in the Open Science Pavilion, which I think will be exciting. And then there are ways to connect with us online. So with that, we can wrap it up. But thank you so much, all of you, for making time in your schedule and joining us. And we will be back in January.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Mhm.